Welcome to the Art Studio Insights podcast, where we demystify the creative process and exchange ideas with career-minded artists. We are your hosts, Adriana Amay and
Jackie Sanders. We are two emerging artists sharing for the advice and business lessons we have learned along our journey. So if you are not already, please go ahead and subscribe. This will help other creatives like you find our podcast, and you will be notified when we drop a new episode every week.
So on today's episode, we are going to be talking about that moment that as a career-minded artist, everybody has to reach at some point, increasing your prices. So this can be kind of the type of conversation that sometimes for some, it's like, well, what if I go too far? What if it's not enough? Like, it's just part of a broader conversation regarding pricing. But being that it's the beginning of the year for a lot of creatives, this is the perfect time to raise your prices. Like, already the holidays are done, usually from a activity, like event perspective, everything, it's going to be quiet for the next month or two. So this is the perfect time to go ahead and reevaluate your pricing and then going from there. But that's what we're going to dive into. So without further ado, let's first start with a question. Why would you even raise your prices in the first place, Jack?
Yeah. So the infamous, okay, well, I think the initial reaction, like you said, most artists would get is kind of that gut punch feeling, maybe having some self-doubt in your mind of, who am I to raise my prices? Is it even worth it? Will people call me out for it? And realistically, as an artist, you're also a business owner. And having to look at the economy just in general, I mean, the cost of living goes up every year. Annual inflation, like this year, I think it was like 5%. Don't quote me on that. All I know is my apartment rent definitely went up. So prices for everything are going up. So just in general, to account for inflation, it makes sense to have to raise the prices of your artwork, but also your creative development in career. Like, you as an artist have gotten better, and therefore your art has become more refined. So your body of work and all of the pieces that you're making have gone up in value, especially if you've hit some bigger milestones in your business, if you've been accepted into group exhibitions, if you've had solo exhibitions. Those are those little milestones that along your career path heighten your creative development and professional development to where your work then becomes more valuable. And so when people invest in you by investing in your art, that should go up in value too.
Yeah, and you can think of it as, I mean, going into basic economics and without diving too deep into it, because I do take pricing ethics and how to price and all kinds of those classes during
The
business
business
school.
major.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Pricing was definitely a thing. A big topic of conversation. And while a lot of it we were looking at from, say, like a manufacturing standpoint and what do consumers pay, etc., we also went into things like luxury goods. And if you think about it, art in many ways is considered a luxury good. Mostly because it's not as easy to price. It's not like, okay, the price of a car is X because it costs so much in parts and labor to make it.
Right.
And then you add, a profit margin to it. You add, kind of bump it up, and voila, that's the price of it. And then you want to stay compared to your peers at an X amount. Not so much with art. You could have a sketch that Picasso didn't like, balled up, threw in the trash can, and it sells for $5 million.
Right.
And it was literally something he disposed of that somebody like took out of the trash can and saved for 50 years, and then it came out. You know what I mean? Like, there's no set way to really price this regardless of the quality of it. It's almost, in a way, there's several factors, but in a way, one of the things that will determine your pricing and whether it's time to raise it or not, it's basic economics, honestly. It's offer and demand. If you're in high demand and you're selling like hotcakes, it's time to raise your prices, right? You shouldn't be selling out all the time. I mean, it sounds great,
but then you're going to be in the moment for sure.
But then you'd be like, flag. Yeah, you'd be turning like into a factory, always cranking out for that sale. So it's not the way it's supposed to go, right? If you think about it too, it's like collectors won't, like the serious collectors, I should say, they won't buy your artwork if the price seems too low, because they're going to be wondering, why is it so cheap? Yeah. And if it seems too high, they might be wondering, why is it so overpriced? So that means that the price, when it's considered as overpriced, is exceeding the perceived value of your artwork. And then get this, your brand. And you as
And
the
I,
artist are the brand.
and I think
So
that's the biggest thing, that perceived value. That's, I think, the biggest thing that makes it so hard to quantify. And
yep.
we talk a lot about pricing within the level of artist membership and different strategies that you can take. There's definitely not a one size fits all. We kind of share how we do it and factors to consider, but definitely having to think about, yeah, cost of materials, time spent, but also perceived value is a huge factor of it.
Yeah, and I mean, in the same vein, talking about perceived value, if your artwork is getting into high profile museums and gallery exhibitions,
Yeah.
basically you're getting that recognition, you are getting street cred, so to speak,
Yeah.
right?
You're building a
Um,
reputation.
yeah, you're building that reputation. Your perceived value is likely to be higher than the artwork of similar, in similar styles, similar artists, maybe even similar techniques, similar execution of other artists, but you're the one that's getting into all these high profile situations and they're not. Well, the collectors and the people that are visiting these different events, these different institutions, not always, but they tend to also have, let's just call it a higher budget
Yeah.
in terms of purchasing the work. So they're a little less, and this sounds terrible, just bear with me. These are business terms, but they tend to be a little less insensitive about the price of things. It doesn't
Yeah.
affect them as much. They're just like, whatever, $2,000, $5,000, $10,000 for a painting. It doesn't break the bank. That's still petty cash. So by increasing your recognition, it's also in a way to get into, well, target collectors that have a larger budget. So there's nothing wrong with that. But
Yeah. And
it's all about perceived value, honestly.
exactly. And I think that's one thing to really think about too, of as a business owner, yes, wanting to increase your prices accordingly, but thinking about who your target audience is. I think that brings up a great point, Adriana, in terms of some high ticket item collectors, and different series of work that you have may have different target audiences. So understanding, one thing that I think about a lot is, for the person that's meant to own this work, what does that budget look like for them? And kind of using that gauge of, what would someone impulse buy without even batting an eye? For some people, that's like $8 to $12. Anything over $20, they may have to think about, or they might feel in their budget a little bit more. Maybe if you're a student or really tight on your budget, making a $25 purchase is something they have to think about. For other people, they'll go out to a restaurant, they'll go out to Target and drop $200 and not even think twice about it. And that's another group of people. Like you were saying, another group of people might drop $2,000, $5,000 on a painting, and they don't necessarily have to ask their accountant for permission of if they can afford it or not. Like, there are different brackets in terms of the finances people are willing to spend. And so thinking about that in terms of when you go to increase your prices and just pricing in general, who is your target audience for this series of work or just your work in general, and making sure that those are aligned. And if they're not, if you realize, okay, I can't realistically charge this little for this work, you might have to shift to your targeting, who you think your intended audience for work is.
Yeah, that's a great point that you brought up, because when you're looking at your pricing and evaluating whether to raise the prices or not, there are a few questions that may pop up that make you feel hesitant, and it does tie into
Yeah.
what you said, depending on who normally buys your work. So let's say, like you said, let's say that your target audience, a lot of them are college students, and their budgets tend to be, not everybody, but usually, right?
Stereotype.
Generally, yeah. Overgeneralizing here, a lot of students have a tight budget. So you might be worried, like, hey, will that student that's always bought for me, now suddenly I've raised their prices and now I'm outside of their pricing range? Are they going to notice and make a comment about it? Or what if I raised my prices and now suddenly people are perceiving it as too expensive? So it becomes that question too of, okay, speaking of that target audience, well, that target audience, perhaps, like, they'll have a what's the word I'm looking for? Their budget may increase over time, especially if we're
Right.
talking about students and then they enter the workforce and have like the more serious jobs and now they can afford more. So there is the possibility that their budget will grow as your
They'll evolve
journey,
as you evolve.
exactly, their journey continues. But it's also a conversation of, do you want to wait till that happens, or do you go into, well, yes, I want college students to be able to afford my work, and perhaps I can have some items that would be affordable for college students too, which we'll talk about in a second. But perhaps that's not the main group that's purchasing from me if I want to go towards a higher budget bracket, if we can call it that.
Yeah,
Then I need to adjust my pricing, number one, and then number two, perceived value. How can I align my brand and the way I present myself and I present my artwork? Again, we are assuming you are evolving your artwork as you do this as well,
exactly.
but how can I present myself, kind of like moving up that ladder, if you will, as well with my artwork, towards an audience that has perhaps a larger budget, if that makes sense.
Exactly. And I think that brings up that key point of, yeah, are you looking to evolve with your audience and have the patience and hope for that? Or really taking that hard look of, are your current customers also your future customers? And for some individual cases, that may be a yes. But I think especially it's almost those quick wins when you're first getting started on your creative journey of maybe less than 20 bucks, less than 50 bucks, even less than 200 bucks sales. But then what happens when you almost like jump groups of people to, okay, now your average sale is $700. Now your average sale is $3,000. And you might not be willing to wait the 10 years for your 22-year-old collector to then buy a house and need a focus point on top of their mantle. You're going straight to the new homeowners who are looking to support local artists. Um, because I think that's really what you need to look at, especially when looking at your artwork currently too. We kind of have that unique position of one, using our art for creative expression and being able to use it as like our therapy and release in a way, but also being a business owner that has so much control over the products that we make. If you think of all the work that you make as different product and service offerings, then we have direct control over the quantities and which ones we give our focus and attention to, which can be overwhelming at times, but it is such an empowering feeling that not all companies have. And so looking at, okay, if you were to look at all of the work that you currently make, where do those price points lie? Do you offer options in all of these various price points? Because maybe the reason all of your collectors typically spend $50 to $70 is because 90% of your work is less than $100. So they don't even have the option to buy a $500 painting. They don't have the option to buy a $2,000 painting. And I think that's kind of that leap of faith that as you grow as a business, you have to start making sure, okay, within X price budget bracket, what do I have to offer? And then the step up and then the step up. And you can choose whether, okay, you want to stay in one bracket and that'll be your niche and you just double down on that. And that is a conscious choice and that can be great. But you can also choose to maybe offer a little bit of something at each level. And those are just decisions as a business owner that you need to look at, especially when looking at your prices at the beginning of the year and maybe evaluating every 6 months or so. Okay, what is selling the most? Where am I making the most work? And then also what needs to shift in terms of my focus.
Yeah. And also, to play devil's advocate for a second, it might also be a question of, what do you eliminate? So
Right.
for some folks, they might say, no, I'm aiming towards, a customer base that has a higher budget, and I don't want to serve students anymore. And honestly, that
Yep.
is a choice. So you might say my cheapest piece is $500, $1,000, $10,000. I mean, it's completely up to you. So
Yep.
obviously, we like to think of it, and I think Jackie, you're with me on this one. Um, we have like this idea of art should be affordable, right? Original art should be affordable. We also still have to make a living. At least personally, I will always have artwork that I consider affordable for even someone, in college, right? Or actually even in high school, probably.
Yeah.
Simply because when I was that age, I perceived artwork to always be this super expensive thing that I could never get and always wanted. And I want to be able to have that option for, say, that young collector, that budding art lover, to still have something original of mine,
Right.
right? And then, start their collection early on. However, again, I still have to make a living. So I may make limited amounts of, more affordably priced work and then make some larger things too, which, another conversation, previous episode, actually talking about going into bigger work. That's part of that one. But
Yeah. But I think that also accounts to when thinking of that, the way we typically structure ours is there are so many ways to factor in pricing, like we said, where it's like scale or even like evolution in your creative development, where ours is very much scale based. So even though the work may be a smaller piece, so like a 4x4 painting per se, that someone with a lower budget can afford, that doesn't make it a less credible piece in our larger collection. We still want to make sure that the artwork that you're presenting to the world, that is your reputation. That's going to be that piece that person shows to their friends, shows to their family. And so you want to make sure that the quality of your work is not compromised simply because it is a lower budget item. Typically, the easiest way to change that is scale, or maybe rather than being on a canvas, it's a work on paper. Sometimes you can price those a little bit less. It's not necessarily saying, oh, well, because I want to have a $100 painting that's affordable for everyone, I'm going to make them a 3 foot by 3 foot terrible painting and just charge $100 for it. That's not how that works.
no.
Just to clarify, in case anyone mistakes that, of which factors you need to consider in how you lower your prices.
Yeah, that's a good point. Just because it's cheaper doesn't mean it's cheap, so to speak. It should still be part of your work. I know, right?
Tagline: just because it's cheaper doesn't mean that it's cheap.
Well, it's true. Or less expensive doesn't mean it's cheap. I don't know, something like that. But it's true, and that's a really good point. If you're gonna make smaller things for folks that have a smaller budget, it's not. I mean, don't treat it as, oh, I'm just doing this just to sell to people that have less money. Like, that's
you're still proud
no.
of.
It should still fit in with the rest of the story that you're building with your work, the rest of your body of work. So that's, yeah, that was an interesting point. I'm glad you brought that up. But as we talk about like how and when do you make these changes, again, and I think I mentioned this earlier, you want to think about when to evaluate your artwork. So one of the ideas, of course, is to do it, say, in January of every year, or early enough in the year before you start doing events and things like that. Give you time to calculate what your new pricing is like. Give you time to do some research, honestly. So you can look at other artists with similar areas of focus, similar styles, similar experience. Really important, look at the experience. And see, how does your pricing compare? Are you the most expensive one? Are you the most inexpensive? Are you somewhere in the middle? And I don't mean just locally, although that's an easy place to start. You could look at artists in other areas. Perhaps don't look at New York and California. Let's be real here for those of you in the States. Those markets tend to be way higher than the average, so to speak, but definitely give it a look around. And when in doubt, start small. So we haven't talked about numbers yet, and we will. What you don't want to do is do this big price hike. Say you make your prices twice as expensive, realize it's crickets. Nobody's willing to buy it at that price. Perhaps your artwork is not at that level yet, and that's okay.
Right.
And then you have to bring it back down. And then if you did have anybody that did buy at that higher price, well, now they're going to wonder why you charge them twice as much and everybody else is getting a steal. So
I think
perhaps start small. So I'm just going to throw a number out there, and Jackie, I'll let you throw a number out there as well. I feel like at a very minimum, 10% should be a nice, reasonable number, anywhere from 10, 15, even 20%. For some of you, if suddenly you're getting into big shows and whatnot, that might look a little bit different. And I will also make a parenthesis with all of this that we're talking about. We're talking about self-representation. It's a little bit different if you're represented by galleries, depending what your relationship is with a gallery. Some galleries will actually set what that pricing looks like because they have a clientele, they have, the people that they cater to and whatnot, and they might say, you're way under, we need to make your price 4 times as much. They're selling it for you to an audience they already have. That's different. So I do want to bring that up.
They have the experience and education of that hyper specific audience.
Well, they already have the people lined up that are going to buy it, and they know what these folks are willing to buy it for. So I do want to throw that out there as a little bit of a parenthesis, because it might be tempting if you're looking at other artists you consider similar to yourself in style and experience. You might want to look to see if they have gallery representation, because you might say, so-and-so, Joe so-and-so from down the street that I've known all my life that also paints, that paints in a similar subject, style, etc. than I do. We're not competition. We're still different, but we've been growing at about the same rate. Suddenly their prices went up 4 times as much. Maybe I should too. There's more to it. So definitely take a
Right.
look. Perhaps they're working with a gallery and some of their artwork is being sold in California or New York and some high-end market, and that's what hiked up the price. You might not be there. So something definitely to look
Exactly.
around. Yeah.
And I think
Look out
that's
for.
that highlights another really important point when you think about pricing is making sure that you're looking at your work from a holistic series standpoint in terms of, let's say you have artwork in your studio and you have a handful of collectors that come see it, or maybe even just list it on your website. You want to make sure that the pricing makes sense, both for that individual work, but also for your collection as a whole. Like, let's say if you have to make it easy, let's say a 12-inch by 12-inch painting hanging next to a 6-inch by 6-inch painting, where maybe there's the same general style, but the 6-inch by 6-inch painting costs $200 more than the 12-foot by 12-foot, simply because it's your newest piece. The 12-inch one was done like a year ago, and this 6-inch one is like the best piece in your opinion that you've ever made. It's going to be $200 more, even though it's half the size. If you were to see that on a website or in a gallery, it kind of puts some flags up of, from a collector standpoint, why would I pay maybe $100 for this 1-foot painting, but $300 for the 6-inch painting? Like, something's not adding up there. And I think to your point, that makes sense too with gallery representation. And that's something you have to think about with, okay, if a gallery shows your work and let's say a painting is $4,000, if a similar painting, very similar style, creative evolution, scale is on your website for $1,200, there's a discrepancy there. And so you kind of want to make sure that the pricing makes sense across your whole series of work. And that when, yeah, if you do decide to maybe decrease prices at some point because things truly are not selling, you want to make sure that you do so in a very slow step gradual way, because you do want to make sure that you are honoring the collectors that have already purchased your work. So the easiest way to avoid doing a huge hike, like you mentioned, Adriana, and then having to backtrack is to just increase it little by little. Maybe do that 5, 10, 15% annually, maybe every 6 months, depending on those milestones in your business that you're hitting. But that way you make sure that you don't have a collector come into your studio and say, why is this work half the price now? I paid this much. You want to make sure you're honoring your collectors, honoring the people that invested in you early on, and that they still become your biggest advocates, because they'll probably buy more pieces, or they have friends who might want to buy more pieces, and they'll feel a lot better knowing that they got in early, supported you early, invested in your work. And then as those prices slowly climb, they feel better about supporting you.
Yeah. And you did bring up a good point regarding the gallery and keeping the pricing consistent. So whether it's the gallery raising the prices versus what you sell them for on your website or on your studio, they should always be the same. By the way, you would never want to undercut a gallery. You're hurting
Yeah,
their chances of selling and you're hurting yourself too.
right,
So you're paying them to do some of the work that you do as well. Let them delegate it, let them earn their keep, so to speak. They should always match. But then on top of that is, if you already do match and you raise your prices, you got to let them know too, so they can raise it on
right.
their end as well. So definitely always keep them consistent. Extremely, extremely important
And
when it
honestly, it
comes to
makes it a lot
pricing.
easier for you too. I do that
Mhm.
simply from like, some might call it organized. I almost sometimes see it as more of like, I'm just lazy. I don't want to remember all of those different price points. Like, that's a lot to keep a hold of. Like, keep it consistent. Everything's the same. And there's like a reason behind the pricing so that it's a lot easier to keep track of. Of like, what year did I do this? What was I pricing things then? No,
Yeah.
everything's together rises.
Yeah, which also turns into that conversation of having an art inventory system so you can keep track of everything, keep track of the pricing,
Yeah.
keep track of racing the prices, and having some kind of pricing methodology that you can use so that when you say I'm going up 15%, you can do it across the board. But speaking of pricing methodology, that does bring me to something. So both Jackie and I priced based on size, and we use a square inch method.
Mhm.
Just bringing this up real quickly because there are artists that price based on complexity or on the amount
Right.
of hours that they spend on a piece. whole different conversation there in terms of raising your prices. But what I can say is this, regardless of what method you use, and I'm going to use the square inch one as an example, it's very often necessary to have pricing brackets based on size categories. So, for example, you may choose to adjust all of them or just one of these categories. If you say have minis that are $4 a square foot and big paintings that come out to less than $1 per square foot, you may, for example, choose to only adjust the larger one. So know that when you are raising the prices, depending how you perceive your pricing scale to look like, especially based on price or some of the other factors, you don't have to adjust all of it. In my particular case, I look at my minis, I like what they're priced at. I'm going to be raising the prices of some of my larger work. At the end of the day, too, the folks that purchase the larger work are in a different budget situation than those that purchase the smaller ones. They're not going to care if I go up a little bit more on them, because they're going to understand I'm continuing to evolve. I'm investing in my own education and my own evolution as a creative. The work is getting better and they're supporting me on that journey. It's not the same as, say, the minis that somebody may buy for their boss or mother-in-law, and it's just a gift, and that's the end of that. They're not even necessarily collecting it themselves. It might just be a casual, convenient, locally crafted kit, gift that they found maybe by a local artist that they want to give away. And it doesn't tie up to like this bigger conversation of creating a collection, if that makes sense. So do know that, yes, you want to raise your prices, you want to make it uniform, but you can choose what you raise the prices on or not. And then, but wait, there's more. Also tying into something that Jackie mentioned, you want it to be slightly uncomfortable. It needs to make sense based on the amount of time you're spending on your work, the perceived value of your work, the target of customers, of collectors that you are working towards, but still, it needs to feel good. Yeah.
Exactly. And it needs to reflect where you are in your creative development and the milestones that you've hit. So that brings us back to the need to increase those prices and coming back to that during set periods of time, whether it's every 6 months, whether it's every year. Put it in your calendar as a reoccurring event, not saying that you have to increase them every 6 months, but take conscious time to sit with it. Look at all your pieces and say, what has happened in the past 6 months? Does it make sense to increase them? Is there a series of my work, like we talked about earlier, that is just selling like hotcakes? I cannot keep it stocked. That's a great feeling, but a guaranteed way to just spin your wheels. And you're probably overall losing money because you could probably be charging more for each individual piece and you might make less sales, but you're making more money in the process. And so it's a very tough thing to come around as an artist, kind of removing yourself from the creative process and thinking of it as products and as a business. But overall, as you're thinking about pricing your work, it's one of those necessary evils, because in order to continue evolving, continue building your creative business, you need to make money and you need to give yourself the value that you're worth, which means needing to make a profit and paying yourself along the way.
Yeah. And you need to give yourself a raise. If the price of everything is going up, and if you were in a quote unquote regular job, they give you a raise. Why wouldn't you give yourself a raise? And that's how you do it. You have to increase the prices.
Very true.
As you move forward, and making less pieces for more money, you are giving yourself a higher per hour rate if you want to cut it back down to the basics. So why not? You deserve it. You work really hard for this. So
exactly.
Yeah, definitely take a look. But that's a wrap for today's conversation, and we really hope you enjoyed this episode.
As always, both of our blogs will be linked in today's show notes, where you can find episode notes for all of our other podcast episodes.
If you want to stay connected with us between episodes, share what you have learned, perhaps you have some magic formula of how you choose to raise your prices, how often, what amount, go ahead and share it with us. You can find us on social media. I'm at May Art across all platforms.
And I'm at J Sanders Studio on all platforms. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.